Hello, and welcome to Season 3 of The Public Square, a show that explores the public affairs and religious liberty issues that affect our nation and beyond. I'm your host, Paul Goodridge, and I'm the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director for the South Central Conference of Seventh day Adventists located in Nashville, Tennessee. Today, as we begin episode 1 of Season 3, we're going to talk about the importance of religious liberty and the impact that religious liberty and freedom of conscience have on our everyday life. We also want to talk about the threats that we currently face when it comes to the issue of religious liberty. And finally, with this being a general election year, we want to talk about the importance of voting and voter registration. So, thank you for joining us, and let's meet in the public square. In our first segment, joining me this evening is Amira Al Haddad. She's the Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Southern Union Conference of Seventh day Adventists. She is a certified paralegal, and while attending paralegal school, she interned in the General Civil Department at the Tennessee State Attorney General's Office in Nashville, Tennessee. She currently serves as the director of the Religious Liberty Department and oversees a diverse range of public affairs and religious liberty issues, including but not limited to assisting church members with Sabbath accommodation problems, legislative issues throughout the union, and a wide range of ever changing issues that involve church and state. Amira, welcome back to the public square. All right. I think you're muted. There you go. There you go.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be back, and congratulations on starting season number 3. I remember
Thank
3
you.
years ago doing episode 1, season 1 with
That's
you,
why.
and
Exactly.
congratulations. We made
Thank
it
you.
through the
Thank you.
pandemic.
Hey, we did. We did. We did. We did. Well, listen, you are, and I don't, I'm not ashamed to say it, you are a guru when it comes to religious liberty issues and public affairs issues, not just here in the Southern Union. And for those who are watching, when we say the Southern Union in terms of the Seventh day Adventist Church, okay, Amira, I've asked you before. I'm not going to ask you to do it in alphabetical order, but what are the territories covering the Southern Union?
So we have 8 states and 8 conferences. So I'll
Mhm.
just say the states for you because we have conferences that overlap.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, and I'm going to be in trouble for forgetting somebody. And I said Georgia.
Yes.
Who did I
Uh,
forget?
Mississippi? You said Mississippi?
I said Mississippi.
Okay.
It's a
Oh,
lot
wow.
to
Well,
remember.
I know. We'll have to go back and,
So someone I've
and
forgotten
check.
someone, and someone is now insulted and mad at me. So
Exactly. But you still represent them. You still represent them. So you said Florida, right?
Florida, maybe Florida. I didn't
Yeah.
say
Okay.
Florida.
All
Yeah.
right. Okay. But it's fine. So listen, for those who, may be new to the public square, who may be new to the whole idea of religious liberty, just tell us briefly, what do we mean when we talk about religious liberty?
Wow, that's it. That's really a big, big question, and I'm going to try not to pull out my preacher voice right now.
Okay.
But religious liberty is a lot of things. Religious liberty is an idea. Religious liberty is foundational to how we express ourselves in our nation. It is foundational to our republic. Our Constitution is based on 10 amendments. We refer to them as the Bill of Rights. Religious freedom is talked about in that First Amendment, which is part of the Bill of Rights. Um, the
Mhm.
United Nations says that it is a a basic need. It's a basic right to have religious freedom, the ability to have religion, to the ability to change your religion. There was religious liberty in heaven. It's what started the rebellion in heaven. And so that's important to remember. It's a gift from God. And
Mhm.
because it was born in heaven, because of all the things that it was in heaven, it really for us has become a gift from God. And I think that that's kind of the package that you want to sum up religious liberty and religious freedom talking
Mhm.
about it is a gift from God to us, even people who aren't religious. It is a gift from God because it gives them the right not to be religious. So
Yes.
I don't know. I kind of get excited. So
No, that's okay. That's okay. So, in real terms, it's about the ability to have a particular religious belief or not, and then to be able to practice that belief without fear of reprisal or intimidation or persecution, etc. So now, over the years, there has been a linking between public affairs and religious liberty. So, what do we mean by public affairs? And then, how are the two kind of, now linked together in terms of our, whether it's our conferences or our unions or a division?
well, I think that, and this is just my take on
Hmm.
Adventist history for the department, is that because we're public affairs and religious liberty, if you talk about religious liberty just within our own religious body of the Seventh day Adventist Church, you don't go very far. You don't do very much to preserve and defend it. And so, what you have to do is you have to kind of spread your wings a little further outside of the church because you have to
Hmm.
engage with the government because they're the ones that give you, even though God has given it to us, they're the ones who help you to defend and protect it. And uh, and so you have to engage with that. And so in engaging with that, it kind of created an atmosphere where the Religious Liberty Department was also working in issues of advocacy,
Hmm.
from our early church foundings, where you were this small Protestant group of believers who keep Sabbath, very different than everyone else who keeps Sunday.
Yes.
Now you have to defend that. You're defending that in your states. You're defending that in your local cities sometimes. You're defending that in the national arena. And so that put us in a position where other advocacy work that we needed to do on behalf of the church was just a natural fit. And so from religious liberty issues of like Sabbath observance, we move into issues of non-combatancy,
Hmm.
whether or not you're going to take up arms and fight during the Civil War. Our church started while this nation was divided, brother against brother, over the issues of slavery and whether states had the rights to do what they wanted to with slavery and that kind of issue. Uh, and
Hmm.
so our church founders wanted peace. They said we are a peaceable people, and we don't want to be forced into killing brother against brother, pitting brother against brother in that manner. So we're non-combatants. So, to do that, then you have to engage in advocacy work with your government to try to get
Yes.
different kinds of service. And so
Hmm.
it just kind of snowballed from there in the things that we did and advocated for. We've gone to bat, advocacy for many, many different things, not just this idea that we're going to protect Sabbath accommodation in the workplace, but we have to protect everything that we believe and hold as a denomination, and we can't just take that for granted wherever we may live around the world.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And part of what we look at, and I think we need to, yeah, part of what we are looking at when we are um, dealing with this idea of public affairs and religious liberty is the fact that on the religious liberty side, it's our ability to um, operate with freedom of conscience, etc. But then with the public affairs side, it's our it's the relationships that we build with legislators to be able to be in a position to tell them, hey, I know that you're advocating for this piece of legislation, but let me share with you the impact, maybe even the unintended consequence that this particular piece of legislation will have on this particular group, or to a larger sector. And again, it's not, as you kind of alluded to, it's not just in terms of the area of religion, but whether it's in terms of housing discrimination, or whether it's um, financial, or where you're going to put the hospital, or where you're going to put the store, the supermarket, in terms of food deserts. So it's all of those things in which we are seeking to advocate for others, so that there is freedom, and there's equity, and there's justice, and equality, etc. So,
Yeah.
as we look at where we are in 2024, and 2023 was tumultuous. 2024 already has been, pretty crazy. Are some of the issues that you see related to even some of the threats that exist within either our territory or our country at large when it comes to religious liberty, or freedom of conscience?
Uh, since the pandemic, it seems like it's never ending.
Hmm.
Definitely, I will say this on the good side of things. I think that this last year, with the Supreme Court ruling in the Groff versus DeJoy post office case, I think that that was a win, and we're very pleased with what happened in that particular case. And for those who don't know about
Thank
that
you. I was going to
case,
ask. Yeah.
uh, yeah, we we are happy about that case because the Supreme Court took a look at religious accommodation in the workplace and said, we think that employers need to show that there is a substantial burden to the organization in not allowing this individual to be accommodated for their religious belief. Up
Hmm.
until this past summer, employers had very little that they had to do to show that something was going to create a burden. And in actuality, all they had to do was show that there was de minimis cost. And for those people out there who are not Latin scholars, de minimis cost means the least amount of cost. So
Hmm.
if it's the least amount of cost to accommodate somebody for Sabbath accommodation or for Sabbath scheduling, then a company could very easily get out of an accommodation situation. What the Supreme Court did was to say, no, we believe that you have not applied the rule of law correctly here, and that you have to show that you did something substantial, that you made an actual effort to accommodate, and that not being able to accommodate them was going to create a substantial problem
Hmm.
for the company. Now, in the
Yeah.
case of Groff, he was a post office letter carrier, and he delivered mail and he delivered packages. And they had switched him around a couple of times, and he finally ended up quitting, which I always tell my church members, don't quit if you're having a
Hmm.
Sabbath problem. he was very lucky in that they didn't disqualify his case because he had quit. But the reason they didn't disqualify him is because he had this history of trying to get the accommodation in the post office, just keeping rolling over on him and not, coming up with different reasons to try to make him work. So, when we're talking about things that we're looking for, we look back one year and we say, hey, that's a relief. It's not that we're not going to keep watching that. We are, but that's one thing off of our plate. Now as we roll into this new election year.
Well, before you roll in, sorry to interrupt, but I just
Yeah,
want to make clear an interesting point, because this individual, this postal worker, was asking for accommodation for Sunday.
yes,
His Sabbath is not a Saturday's Sabbatarian, but for
right.
Sunday. And so the Supreme Court basically said that you observe Sunday as your day of rest, as your Sabbath, and you should be able to have that accommodation. Your employer should be able to give it to you based on the fact that it's not a grave hardship for them to find another mail carrier to work on a Sunday. Now, it's different if this individual was the top physicist or something like that, in which is more specialized. Then finding another individual with that level of skill and that level of experience might be an issue. But it with the type of position that he was holding, it's not that grave a hardship to find somebody. So I just wanted to point that out, because many times, in terms of when it comes to religious liberty, and I know within the religious liberty department, not just within the union, but also the division and the general conference, we work with outside individuals who are not Adventists, but we share the common idea of protecting a particular point of view or liberty. And so a win for them is also becomes a win for us.
Absolutely. And in the case that we're talking about, the Groff case, we were very involved as a church in that case. We
Hmm.
had actually put forward two other cases to the Supreme Court over the last 5 years. One of them, well, actually, both of them were from the Southern Union,
Hmm.
and the Supreme Court did not pick up either one of those cases, but they continued to tell us that they were interested in taking a case because they did want to examine this undue hardship, this, more than de minimis cost issue. And it's
Yes.
just that they finally took it up on this one. It, also, for the Groff case, he had a double whammy on his case because he he wasn't just a post office worker, so he has management to contend with, but he's
Hmm.
also, because there's a labor union in the post office, he also had to contend with labor union. And the labor union wasn't on his side in this either. So both the labor union and management were against him. Most people
Yes.
don't realize that the US Postal Service is our number one employer problem that we deal with across the North American division for Sabbath problems. So we always have one. Sometimes we have to have two. I have had
Hmm.
four post office cases running at the same time. Uh,
Yes.
it's not a it's it's not a happy place to work all the time, and they do tend to look look hard at people who want a specific day off. So
Yes. Yeah.
yeah,
But
but
now,
going forward to other,
yeah.
yeah, other
No,
other
go ahead,
things that we're
please.
looking at. Yes, we wanted to. We want to keep an eye, obviously, on the election, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about the election later on.
Mhm.
But the difference between why the election is important and why would just sit back and not do anything, is because here in the United States, our government is a republic government. It's a
Hmm.
republic. It's not a monarchy, and so we need to remember going forward that we are our voice is what matters here. We don't have a king of America that sits and rules at his discretion or her discretion, a queen.
Hmm.
But we are the voice of the government. The government, we elect our elected officials. The elected officials, hopefully, will do as the people who have elected them want them to do. Uh, and so it's important because this is what makes us shareholders in the democracy. And without your voice, without your vote, because your vote is your voice, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
without your vote, you lack a standing as a shareholder. And I think that that's one of the reasons why there's this contention over voting rights and districting and redistricting because people know that your vote is your voice, and
Hmm.
so it's important that uh, that you make your voice heard. Why is it important? Because um, you want to make your voice heard, especially on issues of religious freedom and preserving religious freedom. And I say that with with some trepidation, because the reason I say that with trepidation is because it's not just about preserving religious freedom. It's also about this other part of the Constitution that we call the Establishment Clause. And it's also about preserving the separation of church and state. And
Hmm.
there are people, many elected people out there today who don't think that the separation of church and state should be preserved. And you need, as a voter, you need to find out who those individuals are. Ellen White doesn't tell us how to vote, but she does tell us who not to vote for. And one of the people she
Hmm.
says not to vote for are people that will not preserve religious freedom and keep separate church and state. And so those two things have to go together. And the problem is that we're finding one party likes to keep separation of church and state, and the other party likes to keep or preserve religious liberty. And so where do you find that middle ground in elected representatives who will come together and do both? That's what's at issue. And I think that going forward in America, at least this year, is going to be or should be a very important uh, top 10 item for Seventh day Adventists to think about. Not whether
Hmm.
somebody will do one or the other, but will someone do both? And that's what's
Yes.
important. Yeah.
So that kind of brings us, you know, transitioning, beginning to go into our next segment, because we actually have some individuals who we'll talk to after a quick break, who are kind of on the front lines dealing with um, the impact of religious liberty on particular issues that we face, and we kind of want to talk to them and get their perspective on what some of the major issues or the threats there are to religious liberty. And then we're going to have you come back after that segment, where we're all going to talk about this idea of voting, and we'll pick up on what you're saying in terms of the importance of letting our voice be heard and making sure that we prepare for that. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with three other guests. So we'll be right back after this. So we're back, and I have three guests joining me, three individuals who represent different perspectives when it comes to this idea of religious liberty and justice, etc. So I'm going to bring them on now. The first I'm going to introduce is David Person. David Person is a media personality, consultant. He's a talk show host, a columnist, director, producer. He's a community activist. He is kind of like a jack of all trades, but but master of them all. So David, welcome to the Public Square.
Thank you, Paul. It's good to be here.
All right. Then we also have Stephanie Scott. Stephanie Scott, a native of Omaha, Nebraska. She actually started off studying architecture, but then realized her passion for people and helping people allowed her to pivot to a career in human resources. She's worked as a director of human resources for more than 25 years in Chicago. And in 2019, she became the human resources director for the South Central Conference. In her spare time, she enjoys reading, traveling, and taking care of her horses. She's married and has three adult children. Stephanie, welcome to the Public Square.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. And lastly, we're joined by Alana Thomas. Alana Thomas is a graduating senior. Yeah, let's give it up for Alana. A graduating senior at Oakwood University with a passion for social justice issues, leveraging studies in both public policy and correctional science. She's always eager to discuss the intersection of of between policy and the law. She also serves as the president of the Oakwood University chapter of the NAACP. Welcome, Alana.
Thank you.
All right. So, listen, each of you have a unique vantage point and lens from which you look at the issues, and especially those affected by either religious liberty or freedom or justice or equity, etc., and public affairs. So, from a personal perspective, what has caused or what has birthed your interest in these areas? And I'll begin with you, David.
I think my interest was birthed during my childhood.
Hmm.
My parents made sure that I had books in my collection that dealt with civil rights. And reading those books about Black history, personalities, and issues through the decades in this country, I think really awakened that in me. And then as I became an adult and began to realize there were a myriad of issues out there, I think during college I became active, at least openly supportive of the anti-apartheid movement
Hmm.
related to the ensuring that the people of South Africa were freed from the rule of the white minority there, and then and then other issues, including LGBTQ issues and people with disabilities and women's issues, just all of those things. I think the
Yeah.
commonality that exists there is that we have a group of historically oppressed people who have been challenged by uh, their rights to live and to thrive have been challenged by society and usually often very specifically government, but
Hmm.
sometimes even the church. And
Yes.
so all of
Yeah.
that I think has caused me to do the kind of work that I do.
Okay, okay, and I do want to say you do a lot of great work in the community here in Huntsville where you live, but not just Huntsville, but Alabama, etc. I know even your Alabama podcast, you're dealing with issues that people may not necessarily want to address, but you try to shine light on those kinds of issues. I want to come to you, Stephanie, in terms of, yes, you're working in HR, but I know you also have a passion for this, this area and these kinds of issues. Where does that come from?
I had the opportunity while in Chicago to work with a population that was in general marginalized and disenfranchised, primarily with women and children who are low income, victims of domestic violence, and child abuse. And um, dealing with that particular population, I clearly could see the injustice based on gender, injustice based on economic privilege or lack thereof.
Hmm.
I often had the opportunity, the organization I was working with worked very closely with the Illinois court system, and and specifically had offices in the Chicago Police Department, and so did a lot of training in those areas for officers, police officers, and for court personnel. And so, just trying to be an advocate and a voice for individuals who didn't always have rights was probably the beginning of my interest in equity and justice.
Okay, okay. And Alana, we're going to come to you in terms of, you're starting out your journey, but based on your major and your interest and your position as the president of the local NAACP chapter for Oakwood University, what has sparked your interest in public policy and um, justice, etc.?
Well, both of my parents, I'm the daughter of two Army veterans. So, topics of freedom and discussions about, our rights as Americans as a whole has always been something that um, I've borne witness to. But when I was younger, I witnessed the trial of George Zimmerman for Trayvon Martin's murder. And I think that's really what piqued my interest. As a child, like obviously because my parents were in the military, I assumed, and probably just because by nature of being a child, like I didn't necessarily understand that these sorts of injustices could happen in our country, and so I think I was very shocked when the verdict came back as what it was.
Hmm.
And so after that, I kind of was always just interested in consuming media and literature and things of that nature that kind of touched on um, how we can kind of mitigate those injustices. And so when I was in high school, I watched a documentary done by Time Magazine on Khalif Browder, and he's someone who was wrongfully convicted, and he spent a number of years on Rikers Island. And when he was released, he took his own life just because of the mental toll that being in prison took on him. And so after that is when I decided like this is kind of what I want to dedicate my life to, because it's something that I think we can all um, we can all understand as a Black community. When we see one of us in pain, we are also in
Hmm.
pain, and I kind of decided from that point on that I wanted to study this, and that's why I'm here. So,
Okay, okay. So let me just follow up on that because one of the things you talked about is this idea in terms of studying correctional science. So what are some of the issues that you feel are threats to justice, freedom, etc., that we're facing now in 2024? And then I'll also ask this, David and Stephanie, if you can be prepared to also answer that from your perspective. So, Alana, as a young person, within your generation, what do you see are some of the threats, some of the issues that need to be addressed in this area of equity, justice, fairness, liberty, conscience, etc.?
well, that's it's definitely a loaded question, But I think I would say, as a whole, the thing that I think is the biggest threat is definitely just private interests in terms of, I mean, money has always been something that runs the world and makes the world go round, but I think that nowadays I see how money is placed over morality and truth and facts. And even with what's going on right now in Gaza with, the Palestinians and Israel and what the U.S. position is today, um, I think we've kind of moved away from public interests and human rights and towards, kind of what certain what things would benefit certain groups over other groups, or what things would benefit us as a country more than other groups. And so I think even with what I was speaking about earlier with criminal justice and things of that nature, um, with private prisons and things like that, it's like when there's money involved, we kind of put the institutions over the people. And I think that that's probably the biggest threat that that um, that I see as a young person. And it can be overwhelming. It can be very overwhelming. So, yeah.
Hmm. David, what have you found in terms of this idea of self-interest over the welfare of others within your experience working with communities, etc.?
Well, I think one pressing issue that faces us as a society today is government interference and intrusion in a woman's right to get the kind of health care that she may need. I think that's a grave, grave challenge on a number of levels.
Hmm.
When you look at it from a religious standpoint, I think it's a challenge, also politically, and of course medically. So that's one issue that I think is very serious and very severe, and I think we're going to have to really wrestle with that as a nation, and it's going to be very challenging. The right to vote, the right to vote is being challenged. I think in various states, we're seeing efforts being made to suppress the vote, to limit opportunities for voting, and then simultaneously we're seeing because of all of the controversy swirling around our former president, we're seeing also, I think, some pressures to see court rulings and state policies and federal policies altered in such a way that or affected in such a way that um, there will be less value placed on the votes of the people. And
Hmm.
we're seeing more efforts being made to see the votes of the people being offset by the will of the powerful. There's some secretaries of state, for example, who were during the last election were being tempted to usurp the rights of the people as it relates to the vote,
Hmm.
and that has not gone away as a threat. And so we've got issues like this that I think are facing us as Americans and as Christians, and we've got to stand up and address these issues.
Yeah, yeah. So, the common thread that I'm hearing between you and Alana is this idea of um, self-interest over individual rights, etc. So whether it's money leading to overlooking human right abuses, or whether it's um, uh, you know the manipulating the election system, the voting system, how you vote, where you vote, who can vote, etc., to be able to promote self-interest. This idea of protecting the individual and allowing the individual to be free is, is one of the threats. I think the common threat that I see throughout here. Stephanie, what about you? What do you see as some of the major issues that we're facing in and will face in 2024?
I think one of the things that I've noticed is sort of an apathy across the country. I think people are fatigued with the political system, not necessarily particularly thrilled with either candidate or the two major parties. And so I think that there's a general apathy for people to become involved because I think that individuals feel like either their vote won't matter or um, they're going to get the same thing regardless of how they vote. And so there's sort of this general or cynicism that's out there, this general attitude that's out there that, it doesn't make a difference. I've seen it, I believe, in the last two election cycles, a lot on social media where individuals are like, you know what, it doesn't make a difference. I'm not gonna vote. It doesn't matter. Um, People are corrupt. Uh, the powers that be, there's nothing that we can do. And so there's sort of a giving up and throwing in the towel that I think uh, absolutely impacts the outcome of elections. And this being 2024, being an election year, it makes me nervous that people have already decided that they aren't. The fact that they can vote doesn't matter. They're just not going to go to the polls because they
Yeah.
don't see a stellar candidate on either party, and so um, that I think is challenging because, as an advocate for voters' rights, I find myself encouraged, you have to go out there and vote, not just in the
Hmm.
national election, but also in local elections because those things do matter. And
Sure.
then you can't sit on the sideline and complain when stuff doesn't go your way because you didn't actually participate. So I think that's one of the things that I've seen, in addition to the things that Alana and David have already spoken about.
So, and I know that we're talking about election, but we'll kind of in our last segment we'll talk a little bit more about election. But I do want to say, because Stephanie, you brought up this point in terms of, oh, what's the point? It almost like the system is rigged. Um, and so with that kind of apathy and that understanding and the power of politicians and the power of systems to keep down individual rights or to fight the little person, from each of your perspectives, as you are on the wall, as a watchman, crying out, what do you feel we could do, what do you feel we should do, and is there still a place for religious liberty and standing up and advocating for others? And you can just talk freely.
I do think that there are several things that we can do from the Seventh Day Adventist churches, from the conference's perspective. I think that we absolutely should be promoting from the pulpit active involvement in politics. That has not always been historically our position, I don't think. Or
Hmm.
maybe it's been a position, but we haven't verbalized it. But I'm guessing that it was not our position. So I do think now I do know, we probably shouldn't get up and promote a particular candidate. I'm not suggesting that, but we certainly can open our churches, our schools as polling places. We can encourage our membership, our employees to read the platforms of the candidates, like get actively involved so that you aren't just voting blindly in a vacuum. I think that that can come from leadership down to our employees, our pastors, our teachers, and then trickle on down to our membership. So I think that there are things that we actually can do.
David?
Um, yes, I agree with Stephanie. I think there are things we can do, and I think there are things we should absolutely do. We should follow the Christ model and the model of the Old Testament prophets, especially those who called out for justice and were
Hmm.
clear about the fact that we need to stand for the oppressed. We need to stand up against injustice. Jesus certainly modeled that. And if we are to be Christians, I don't see how we don't do that. I think we should be very clear, unambiguously clear about the fact that while we may not choose to be partisan as a church,
Hmm.
though I'm certainly partisan as an individual, but we may choose to we may it's probably good that we're not partisan as a church, but we can still, I think, stand up and say that a presidential candidate or any candidate for that matter who whose platform is riddled with lies and obfuscation and 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 who regularly belittles people and disrespects people, who traffics in hate, that ought to be a candidate that the church can oppose, even if they still, maintain the position that they're open to candidates of any party. We
Hmm.
should be able to take a stand and call evil evil. And the fact that we don't tend to do that, I think, is really unfortunate. I think we should have the courage, the moral courage and fortitude to call evil evil and to point out evil when one candidate is embodying that.
And broadening it to a from a particular candidate to even a set of policies, because you can have an individual who may have a squeaky clean image, etc., but just the policies that they espouse that routinely oppress other individuals, that routinely subvert and uh, uh, yeah, prevent others from succeeding or from being able to live out and practice their, not even just religious faith, but just the right to live, the right to be able to raise their children and live where they
Right.
want to live, etc. um, Even if it's, the candidate may not have issues themselves, but if they're espousing those policies, we should
Mhm.
be able to advocate against that.
And,
um
and and may I just add one other quick
yeah,
thing,
please,
Paul?
please, please, yeah.
Um, we should be, even if we don't agree with the lifestyle choices or the particular philosophical choices of a group of people, we should, in this country, we should be advocating for their right to
Hmm.
take positions that they believe in. We should be advocating for their right to pursue destiny as they see fit, even if we don't agree with their
Hmm.
interpretation of that destiny.
Yeah.
That's the whole point of being in a non theocratic, democracy. And this
Hmm.
is, I think sometimes we get confused with, what we should be espousing as members of a church and what we should be espousing as members of a non-theocratic, democracy. They're two different. They're overlapping experiences, but what we should be standing for, ultimately in this society, is the right for everybody to pursue what they believe to be true and correct and what pleases them. That's what we want for ourselves. As Seventh day Adventists, we want the right to be able to worship as we see fit and to
Yeah.
practice our faith. we should want the same thing for the people whose beliefs and practices may be completely antithetical to what we believe.
As long as it
Absolutely.
doesn't hurt other people. Let's put that, as long as it
Well,
doesn't hurt others.
well, yeah, and I think, and that's an important caveat, Stephanie. You're right. As long as it doesn't hurt other people, and I guess my assumption is that if it hurts other people, it's probably already against the law. But that is an important caveat, though.
I mean, to kind of put it in very, very simplistic terms, the way that I kind of view it is if there is a cookie and every American citizen has the right to get that cookie, to then discriminate and say that there are individuals who are American citizens, but we're saying, no, you can't have that cookie because of your, whatever color or thing or whatever, is wrong and is discrimination. And we should be able to fight for the right of that individual to get what is right, what rightfully belongs to them by virtue of being, an American citizen or whatever it is. Um, whether I like it or not, if you're entitled to it, you should be able to have it. So,
Exactly.
um, but now, Alana, in terms of again, and I'm coming to you as the younger statesman, within all of us. So, what do you feel the role of activism is? What would you want to see your church? What would you want to see your community? What would you want to see your colleagues doing to fight some of these issues? Whether it's social or economic or religious.
No, I agree with everything that David and Stephanie said. Um, I think that also something that was spoken about at the convention we were at was just the story of the Good Samaritan and how he was helping someone who was of a different group than him, someone who had a different lifestyle than him, but someone who he saw as human. And I think that, more to what David was saying, that, as a church, our role is to be like Christ and we're supposed to model his character. And I think that um, because Jesus gives us all that freedom to choose him or to not, or to serve him or to not,
Hmm.
regardless of, you know, how he feels about it, because obviously he knows that his way is the best way. He knows that he's righteous. He knows that he's good. He knows all of those things, but he's never going to force himself on us, and he's going to allow us that choice. And so I think that as a church, we need to model that as well. And I think, yeah, again, as to what Stephanie said, I think we could be a lot more vocal about certain things. I think that we could, as a whole church community, because I think as a I don't know if I could say this, but as a Black community, as a Black
Hmm.
Adventist community, I feel as though we speak about social justice issues often because that's something that we personally go through in our daily lives. But I think that, the global church as a whole, other demographics within the Adventist church, I think it would, be just as beneficial to have those conversations and to talk about those things, um, because it is important. And at the end of the day, if we are all considering ourselves children of God, we can't have, dissension among each other. So I think it's important that we all kind of hold it at the esteem that it deserves, and it should be held in high esteem. So,
Okay. Now you bring up an interesting point, and I would love to hear not just your perspective, but also David and Stephanie's perspective. You said that within the Black, Adventist community, or within, and I'm specifically talking about Black Adventism. You're saying that we have spent, or we talk about, um, the injustice, etc., and being, an advocate. But do you feel we do enough? Is it just talk, or are we doing enough to address some of the challenges?
And honestly, that's something that we talk about a lot in my classes because Professor Foster is our professor. He's our advisor for public policy majors and whatnot. And he teaches all of our
Mhm.
classes, but he has made it a point kind of to incorporate like math courses and stuff like that, statistics, and so that we can quantify the things that we talk about. Because something that he said a couple months ago is that sometimes our other counterparts are less likely to uh, hear what we're saying as valid without those necessary metrics. And
Mhm.
so I think that in as much as speaking about an issue is important and raising awareness for an issue is important, I also think that having those metrics and talking about those quantifiable things that we can do to make changes is also important. And even like things like statistics and just trying to measure what it is we're talking about, because it's one thing to have an anecdotal story, and it's another to have facts to back that up and data to back that up. And so I think that as a Black church, we could definitely do some more quantifiable work in the community as a whole. But
Okay. So
I,
David, oh, Steph, you can say something, Stephanie?
well, yeah, I was going to say, to Alana's point, I think that um, the black church just in general has ebbed and flowed. So in the 50s and 60s, the 40s, we saw a lot, particularly in the civil rights movement. The black church was oftentimes at the center of those movements. With regard to the Black Adventist Church, um, I I don't know that. I think that it's generational. So I think that um, my observation, very general observation, is that more recently, in the last 10 years or less, um, the younger generation has been more apt to put action behind um, the action behind the words. And you still have a lot of the older generation that are more conservative, um, because historically the Adventist church has not necessarily, we've been very good at the separation of church and state. We've been very good at, uh, not engaging in political issues and those kinds of things. And you have a generation that still is of that mindset. So I think that there are some generational differences within the African American community. So if you go to an older, Black African American congregation, they may be very conservative and may not be, very interested in becoming politically involved. So I think
Mhm.
that it's both. So I think Black Adventists do get involved, but I also think you see more involvement with the younger generation.
Yeah, yeah. So David, I was gonna say, so we hear about the idea of speaking up and speaking out. Then Alana kind of adds to that. Well, we also need to be informed, and we also need to speak from a quantifiable basis to establish credibility. And then Stephanie is kind of beginning to say, well, there needs to be action. We see a little bit more in terms of our younger generation, but again, as somebody who is out there, who is marching where necessary, who is speaking truth to power, um, how involved do you think we ought to be advocating for the voiceless, speaking up for those who can't, engaging in that public policy work of building relationships with politicians or etc., to be able to advocate for others?
I think it's extremely important that we do that. In fact, I would even argue that the very lifeblood of our church ultimately depends on this because young people like Alana are looking for more than just, vigorous praise, 11 o'clock services with great music and preaching. They're looking for substantive issues that they can get involved with that can help make society a better place, a safer, more just place. They're looking for causes that they can join to help affect change. So I think it's imperative from that standpoint. I also think it's imperative because it's just simply the right thing to do. And I believe that God will bless us for trying to seek to do justice, as one of the Old Testament prophets says, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God.
Hmm.
We ought to be putting that into practice as much as we would say, put into practice keeping the Sabbath or some of the other important things that we embrace as Seventh Day Adventists. I think that's just as important, maybe
Hmm.
more so, because it connects us with society, and it gives us a way to bring Christ to life for
Yeah.
people. We also know, and this will be my final thought on this, Paul. We also know that there is a rise, specifically in the Black community. There is a rise of young people, but not just young people, who are embracing more of a Black nationalist kind of view, an Afrocentric view, and they're applying this not just to politics, but to religion. And in
Hmm.
order to be credible, in order to be relevant, we've got to be on the front lines of issues that affect, you know, the poor and the disenfranchised, but also the historically marginalized people like Black people and
Hmm.
other groups, some of which may make us uncomfortable, like
Hmm.
gay people. But where there are rights being disenfranchised, where there are rights being subverted, we've got to be involved in speaking up for those people, even if we don't agree with some aspect of their lifestyle. The point is, freedom is supposed to be freedom for everybody. It's
Yeah.
not supposed to be a selective proposition.
Hmm. Well, this kind of lends itself into transitioning in terms of being able to speak up and advocate. And one of the huge areas that we need to advocate for is the right to vote. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back, and Amira will join us, and we'll kind of just kind of begin to close. Uh, just talking about the importance of voting and the right to vote. So we'll be right back after this. So again, we want to welcome you and thank you for coming back and joining us. So we have been, throughout the show, we've kind of talked about this idea of voting, and we recognize that this is a very, very important year, an important time, because it's a general election year, and there's a lot at stake. There is a lot that we're dealing with, depending on not just the general election, but we also have local elections coming up. And you've kind of alluded to the fact that we need to get involved, that we need to advocate, etc. But what do you feel our role should be when it comes to, um, the elections for this year and the issues that we face as a result of how the country votes?
Well, one thing that churches have historically done is provided people with transportation to the voting booth, the polls.
Mm.
That's a nonpartisan activity. We should not even hesitate to do that. We can also engage in voter registration drives, another nonpartisan activity. Um, I know in the Black community, it's not uncommon for us to, during election cycles, to open up our pulpits for candidates to come and speak to our congregations. I think we should be open to that. Democrats, Republicans, Independents, doesn't matter. I think that that's a good thing for people to hear directly from these candidates, and those are some, not all of those things can be done in a way that is nonpartisan and won't jeopardize our nonprofit status or link us, to one specific political party. Though I will say, if I may, Pastor Paul Goodrich, that there
Go ahead.
is at the that certain, well, I'll just say evangelical churches, many evangelical churches have gotten to the point where they are openly sympathetic to one political party, and
Mhm.
they are being very overtly partisan. But I know our denomination is not going to do that. So if we're not going to do that, then I see Amira shaking her head. So
Yeah, I
if
want
we're
to hear
not
your perspective, Amira.
if we're not going to do that, then at the very least we should facilitate, voting opportunities to vote for people.
And so, Amira, I'm going to ask you to kind of respond to that. But before you do, again, it's one thing if you're talking about individuals, but I think it's very appropriate to educate the congregation on the issues that are at stake, the issues that individuals are espousing, and the impact of those issues on the congregation or the community or the society. So I think that's very appropriate. What are your thoughts, Amira?
Well, let me be the protector of our tax exempt letter and remind everyone that the Seventh day Adventist Church has but one letter that we all share. And so if one church violates the rules, we all suffer. So when we talk about what can we do to get involved, what I generally tell my pastors in the Southern Union is that everyone's political beliefs in your church could be different. And don't assume that you know how church members are going to vote. Um, because of that, the election prohibitions for the church, because we're a tax exempt a 501c3 entity, is that we cannot engage in political campaigning for uh, uh, politicians. So when the caveat here is that you cannot say, yeah, we all love this person, get up and vote for this person. Likewise, you can't say, hey, we hate this other person, don't vote for this other person. So those are things that we can't do. I as David said earlier, though, there are lots of things that we can do. So voter oh, what do they call it? They called it the cards that they give out that show what each candidate's platform is.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
the platform cards, those, if they are bipartisan, those are acceptable to give out, and I don't see a problem with that. That's a good way to get out what all the candidates hope to do, or promising to do, I should say. David is correct. The voter registration, it has always been acceptable to do voter registrations at your church. But I want to say this about time and appropriateness. So when I go to church, it's almost the one time in my group experience of being in a public setting where I don't have to worry about politics. And when you go to church, there's a feeling that all could be well with the world Jesus does save. You get that high that you get from being at church. And I find that a lot of times when we bring up political issues, even if they're not partisan or speaking to particular candidate issues, I find that when we bring them up in church, we kind of lose our chi, our good chi. Can I say that? you know, we lose that zen that we get from church. So we kind of have to be careful. But there are lots of things that we can do. And the Adventist Church has had a long history of being advocates for marginalized people. I am very proud of the fact that the early Adventist Church and Ellen White especially spoke out about abolitionists wanting to abolish slavery. I'm very proud of the fact that Ellen White, even though Ellen White never lived to see uh, 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 women voting, Ellen White wrote, and she only talked about lads of the day because she had no idea that in the future lassies would still I don't know where she gets her Irish
Mm.
terminology, lads and lassies, but boys and girls of today could could aspire to be leaders, could aspire to have a presence in parliaments and in congressional halls and in kingly courts. And so to encourage our young people getting educations and moving forward into career uh, jobs in going forward, it is appropriate for us to say, hey, you could make a difference by being an elected official or elected leader, and growing that within our society. In the Religious Liberty Department at the North American Division, what we say is that you need to make a friend before you need a friend,
Mhm.
because you're not going to have a friend when you need a friend. So you do that ahead of time. And the best way that you can do that is to be involved in advocacy issues, because no matter what the issue may be, and I know a lot of people, especially um, in our state conferences, a lot of people are turned off by the term social justice, and I still don't really understand that, because social justice is just another way to say advocacy, and
Mhm.
advocating for the marginalized. And you know, Adventists can be the marginalized. I mean, look at how many people keep Sabbath. I mean, we're on the outskirts, we're on the fringes of Protestant Americans today, just because of this one little thing that we do that they don't do. So if we think that because we may identify as white, or we may identify as part of the GOP, or whatever it may be, if we think that that's going to secure our place in being Protestants here in America, we're totally wrong. Because just by the fact that we keep Sabbath, we're on the fringes, we're a fringe group. And
Mhm.
so I think that we need to keep that in mind always going forward, no matter what we try to advocate for, and just kind of remember that.
I
Mhm.
know
A
that.
lot.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry. No, no, no.
I was
Please.
I was just going to say. I know, in my experience, and I've attended. In fact, I've been a member of both um, regional conference churches and non-regional conference churches in our denomination, or a non-regional conference church in our denomination. And I'm going to just be frank and say that I think in our regional conference churches there is more of a sense of urgency, Amira, about the issues that are facing, in particular, Black people, but even more broadly, social justice issues. In the non regional conference church that I was a member of for several years, beautiful people, wonderful atmosphere, but zero sense of urgency about the social justice issues and about the issues facing people of color. And I think there's an important That's an important distinction that we should account for in this conversation. If we're going to be honest, um, the reality that people of color are living with, in particular, black people in particular, perhaps, and Hispanic people, perhaps, and even I'd say people of Middle Eastern descent. Even though the issues are different, there is a there are things that are intrinsic to being in the United States of America and falling into one of those categories that I think brings a very real sense of urgency about dealing with political issues in the church, dealing with them even on Sabbath, because they are a part of life for us. And we don't have the luxury of setting those things aside one day a week because we can leave the church and be confronted with those very issues in a police encounter or in some other situation. In fact, as we know, unfortunately, these days, you can be sitting in church and have to face those realities because of some crazed racist assassin. So, my feeling is that, and every church is free to operate however it wants to. But my feeling is that, especially in the regional conference churches, we don't have the luxury of not being politically aware and politically astute on Sabbath. We don't have that luxury. And I'm glad that I can say that the church that I currently attend, Oakwood University Church, and other churches are well aware of that, and they don't shy away from those issues on Sabbath morning.
Okay.
Yeah.
And can I?
And
I'm
it will
sorry.
differ.
I was just going to add. I just wanted to refer back to a statement that I made, and that is that in the black community, particularly in the civil rights movement, the black church was the hub that's where the meetings were. That's where the organizing was. It's a part not just of our current existence. It's a part of our history. The church and politics in the black community and the African American community has always existed. And even I would go back as far as slavery, when you had the itinerant pastor, the one black person who could read, and was given certain passages of the Bible that they could read. That was always in that church gathering. You were in church. That was the one place where we were allowed to sort of assemble. And so just sort of a part of our DNA. So those things will probably always be intrinsically connected. And so, yeah, outside of just the luxury of it, it just is who we are. So,
And I think that historically, and in terms of the civil rights movement itself, the black church, the historic black church, moved that along. There's no doubt about that was moved along from within the church.
Mhm.
Um, but again, how do you how do you bring, we're talking about black churches in general. I'm overseeing both the regional conference churches and the non-regional conference churches. And so one of my jobs is, how do you make people who don't feel like they're marginalized, or how do you make people who have never faced a discriminatory issue, or how do you make people who have never been pulled over because they were Arabs and driving? This is new in my family. We now say you're Arab and driving.
Mm.
Not just black in driving, but you're Arab in driving. How do you make those individuals feel the urgency when it's really the personal experiences that we each have that motivate us towards the advocacy that we are moved towards? You know, you think of all the groups that are advocating for something. The Mothers Against Mad Driving, that lady probably never thought in her life she would start Mothers Against Bad Driving until drunk driving until her child was killed by a drunk driver, and that's when the reality hit her that that needs to happen. And so, how do you get people who don't face those types of issues talking about those issues or realizing that they needed to move forward? And I know we're a little bit off topic because we've gone back to the social justice issue, but we want to kind of pull it together and say this is why voting is important, and this is why identifying ourselves as voters who have a voice in the decision making is important, because even if you can't get someone else to understand what you're advocating for, at least your voice won't be silenced so that you can advocate for it. And that's what's important about voting, is that maybe everybody will advocate for something different, but you have the right to have your voice go forward and advocate for something that you think is important in the democracy that we live in.
I do kind of want to respond a little bit in terms of how do you um, allow those or help those who may not experience what somebody else experienced still feel. That's the importance, and I'm bringing it to this idea of, again, religious liberty and public affairs. We're not just advocating for our situation and our ability to worship, go to church on Sabbath, or not have to work on Sabbath, or take an exam on Sabbath. We are advocating, we should be advocating for every individual to be able to practice in liberty and freedom of conscience with what they're doing. So it may not affect me today, but you better believe it's going to affect me tomorrow. Again, going back to the Gruff versus DeJoy case, we can say, oh, well, he's talking about Sunday. Oh, okay. Well, we don't have to necessarily worry about that. But the principle of the accommodation says that if they can discriminate against him trying to worship or have the time in terms of his Sabbath, what will stop them from turning around and doing that to us? And so I think that's kind of where, we don't have to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. Just the idea, and I think David, you brought up Micah 6:8. Um, uh, God has shown the old man what is good, and what does he require? To do justly, to love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. Wherever that justice is found, whatever doing right, etc. So I do want to kind of um, uh, allow Alana to jump in a second, and then we'll kind of land the plane. So, Alana, as the president of the NAACP, I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot in terms of Oakwood University. What plans do you all have to help to get people to vote, or encourage people to vote, or maybe even help them to be in a position to register to vote? Because I know it's not just about going and voting, but you've got to be able to register to vote. So what are some of the initiatives you may be having, or that you can think about in terms of that?
And I also wanted to just add to what we were speaking about before, if I could, for just a brief moment,
Mhm.
um, that I think that politics in and of itself just concerns governance and how a body of people is going to decide to um, run things. And so our God is, to me, I won't say he's a political figure, because I think that might be going too far. But his role is to govern us. That is his role. And he's trying to teach us. He's given us an example of how he governs, and how he governs is perfect and righteous in its nature. And his presence and his time period was one of, it was stimulating for that time period because he was a person that was radically different than the political figures of his day. And so, just the nature of the God that we serve, even if we are not of a specific group, I think that if we claim to be people who follow him and people who are of his word, um, we shouldn't be afraid to shake things up or say things a little differently in the pulpit or at church or otherwise, because, like David said, these are the lived experiences of people who look like us and people who don't look like us. And, Jesus was here to set the captives free and to serve the poor. And even though he was, he was the son of God, he spent time with people who were nothing like him. So I think that's also very important. If we get to the core of the God that we serve, that should be the driving factor of our advocacy or our attitude towards advocacy. But
Mhm.
to your question in terms of the NAACP, this semester I'm planning on doing several voter registration drives to get students registered to vote, which we have done in the past. Previous presidents have done the same, and so I'm following suit
Mhm.
as well. And on top of that, I'm going to try to do some informational forums just to kind of educate the student body about the election process. We're going to talk about the Electoral College, and we'll probably present some unbiased information about both candidates as well. Who's running? What are they running on? What you should know before going to the polls. How to request your absentee ballot or whatever, because everyone's here, they're not home.
Mhm.
So things of that nature, just kind of educating everyone about the voting process, and about ways that um, historically, because we're an HBCU, historically, how important voting is to our community, with things like the Voting Rights Act and gerrymandering, things like that, just so that um, the student body knows the importance of our role, especially as young people um, today, because we are the next leaders, and so we need to be equipped to do that. So that's my goal, my team's goal for the semester, is just to educate everyone on that.
All right, that's great, and we'll be supporting you with that. And with this idea of educating, as we continue each episode for of the public square for this season, we are going to deal with some aspect of voting. It's that important, and so our next episode, we're actually going to take the time to deal with voter rights, voting rights, voter registration, the attempts to thwart the vote or disenfranchise individuals from voting, and kind of really deal with the nuts and bolts of voting. And again, why it's important. And, those of you who are watching, I want to encourage you, if you are eligible to vote, please register to vote. There are a number of deadlines that are coming up soon, many of them in February, some of them in early February. I'm looking at a list, especially in terms of our area here in South Central, which is Alabama, Kentucky, Mississippi, um, Tennessee, and the panhandles of Florida. And there are some deadlines in terms of registering, not just for local elections, but also for the presidential election. And so, whether it's February the 16th, in terms of registering by mail, registering in person for if you're in Alabama, or whether it's March the 19th if you're in Florida, or whether it's your uh, um, uh, May the sorry March the 12th in Mississippi, March the 5th in Tennessee, and we will have a list of all the dates, the deadlines in terms of early voting, voter registration, absentee ballots, etc. We'll make that available for you a link on our website. But we do want to encourage you now, wherever you are, look into the important dates as far as voting. Because I think, Stephanie, you had mentioned earlier, if you don't get involved, and if you don't vote, even with the local elections, which is where a lot of the policies are really that really affect us as citizens, as individuals, that's where decisions are made. But if you don't get involved, and if you don't let your voice be heard, and if you don't let your vote be counted, how can you then complain when, again, something as simple as the store is not put in your neighborhood, but is put in another neighborhood, or the funding for the local services that you're depending on is diverted, or dries up because you did not let your voice be heard. So every episode, we're going to encourage you to register to vote, encourage somebody else to register to vote, to go out to vote at the appropriate time, and to bring somebody else with you so that however it goes, and God is in control, but at least we can say we did our part. Amira, David, Stephanie, Alana, I want to thank you so much for joining me. I want to thank you for your input. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that I pray that our listeners will take to heart what you've shared and what you've proposed, so that they can ultimately take action. So again, thank you. We'll be right back after this. If you liked what we did, please share with somebody else. Let them know that we are trying to educate, we're trying to inform, we're trying to ignite, we're trying to inspire, and we're also trying to integrate faith principles with what we do. And so until next time, I'll see you in the public square.